Joining me now is Toure, who has a new book called Nothing Compares to You, an oral history of Prince. Toure, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So I wanted to jump right into a statement you made about Prince in the book, and I wanted you to elaborate on this. Your quote was, he had everything a budding rock star needed: a specific, vivid dream, mountains of determination, painful inner wounds he was trying to heal, and a surreal work ethic. And if anything summarizes I don't know, it's like 270 pages. If anything summarizes that entirety of 270 pages, it's those words right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, I think everybody who becomes a rock, like a super level rock star, they have like something that they're trying to like avoid, they're trying to fill, or some scar. I think about like, Madonna losing her mother when she was really young. Like Michael Jackson, like basically like losing his childhood when he's really young. Like there's some thing that they're trying to deal with, and we may not always know what that is. Um, but Prince felt like his parents abandoned him, and he wanted to get back at them. He wanted to show them that he was an important and valuable person and that they were wrong for letting him go. When he literally left their house, when he was his mother's house when he's about 11, then his father's house, gets kicked out of his father's house when he's about 12. Um, so there's that, and then everything else. I mean, like there's this incredible work ethic. People from his early teens talked about, we would do rehearsals 6, 8, 10 hours playing music. He would not take breaks. If we went outside to get a drink or smoke a joint, he would just stay, at the drum kit or on the guitar or whatever it was, bass, and just keep playing. And then when we finished our rehearsal, he would go home and launch into his own rehearsal. And so it was just this constant flow of rehearsing, writing. He and Andre Simone used to have contests where, like, you go upstairs and I'll go downstairs and see who can write how many songs in 30 minutes, and then come back to the kitchen and like compare notes and see. And, Morris Day talks about Prince knocking on the door of his house because Morris Day had a 4-track recorder and Prince did not. So, midnight, 1 a.m., 3 a.m. I got to get in to record this song that I just thought of. So it's just throughout the teens, the incredible work ethic that we would see in the 20s and hear a little bit more about was already there. And by the 20s, when he's got, some money and some budget, he's doing 24-hour sessions, 48-hour sessions, 72-hour sessions were not unheard of. And I'm talking about, like, he's not sleeping during this time. He goes in the studio, he starts a song, he's going to finish the song. He might do 2 songs in a session, but that means that we're going to be there for 48 hours or 24 hours or whatever it is. He's playing everything. The execution was always perfect. They were never waiting for him to like figure out how to play the line, or even like figure out like, what do I want this to be? He's like, he knew what he wanted, he knew how to play it. He's waiting for the tapes to rewind. Like that was his bet noir. It takes too long for the tapes to rewind so that I can start to play the next part. How do we make these tapes go faster?
Yeah.
So I mean, this is sort of like all the pieces of him. One of his managers talked about, he's like Michael Jordan in that you had the most talent and the most drive. And, when you combine those two things, you get, one of these once in a generation, once in a century superstars.
Yeah, and I think that you need to be that level of determination and drive, obviously, to succeed. But it's interesting because as you read through the book, it's so clear that on so many levels, the only way that he could interact with people was to talk about music. So even when it is a more casual moment, they talk about playing a softball game, and then he's got this conversation at first base, and then he's on second base, and it's like he doesn't really unplug, but it's also I think anybody who's even casually aware of Prince knows how many instruments he played, and the term genius I think gets thrown around too easily, but not in the sense of who this guy was and what he was capable of doing. And I think when you're a genius, that's the only time you think of things like he would want to take tapes of music he would make and listen to it on a shitty car stereo because most people don't have a great stereo. And if it didn't sound right there, then there was something he would have to do. And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure other musicians might have thought about it, but you don't hear about that, you know? And just talk a little bit about the insight in terms of a guy whose mind works that way. It's like, yeah, not everybody's going to have these nice headphones in a big studio to listen to how great this sounds.
Yeah, no, he was definitely really thoughtful about what is going to be the listener experience and thinking about, can I go out to, Jill Jones's car and listen to the mixes through her crappy car stereo speakers. Like that was really thoughtful in terms of like, let me meet the listener, the consumer where they are going to be. I think, if you go into a recording studio, you have top of the line speakers that are blasting really loud. They're perfectly separated. They're perfectly, equalized and all this stuff. And like, that is not the experience that most consumers are going to have. Right. So, but I mean, to what you're saying, the softball game, like, yeah, he was really unable and unwilling, but really unable to have significant conversations beyond music. He was not interested in it, and it was just not happening. And I think part of what happened is that, he's so driven, which we already talked about, to become a musician, that he's completely focused on this. And when he leaves his parents' home, he goes to live with this woman, Bernadette Anderson, who's Andre Simone's mother. And people from the area say, this was like, the most maternal, loving person you could imagine. And if you knew the area and the people of the area, you would not be surprised that somebody who's having a rough time at age 13 would end up in her home, right? She was like a second mother. She didn't have any other foster kids, but she was like a second mother to many other people. Jerome talked about her as like a second mother to him and many others. And Bernadette is this wonderful, loving, amazing person who provides Prince with a lot of the original initial encouragement when he's first writing songs, playing them in her kitchen, and she's that maternal ear that's like, "This is great, keep going." Who knows if these songs were great? Like when your kid comes home with a crappy painting, you're like, "This is amazing, I love it." And
You got to put it on the wall, no matter what it looks like. It's got to
you
go right up there. Yeah.
you put it on the wall and the kid feels encouraged and
Yeah.
seen. And she was doing that for him where Prince's mother and father were not then doing that. So she's providing this initial bridge where like you can go and try your creativity. There is somebody here who will give you encouragement.
Yeah.
At
And
the same
one
time,
of go ahead.
sorry, at the same time, she had 6 children and was divorced and was pursuing an advanced degree throughout Prince's teenage years, while he's living in her basement. It doesn't sound to me like she had a ton of time to lord over him the way most mothers lord over children, and like making sure you're eating your vegetables, are you brushing your teeth, are you doing all the little things. I imagine she was probably like, I love you. I'm providing a home for you. I'm doing the best I can, but I am busy, and I'm not ever saying no to you, but I have to say yes to my 6 children and my, the needs of my advanced degree in social work and all these other things. So this means Prince had a lot of free time to do and develop as he wished, and he wanted to be obsessed with music. He was, and I imagine if he'd had a more traditional structure, he might have had a mom who was like, "No, you got to go to the dance. You got to go. You got to do some of these basic things just to learn basic social interaction." That's so much what our teens are about: how to interact with other people. And you have your failures and your successes with your clique of boys and girls, the girlfriends and boyfriends, whatever. This is where you start to learn the social interaction that means so much in our 20s and 30s. He's eschewing all of that. If we're not playing music, I don't care. I'm not here for it. He played basketball a little bit. He was clearly good. He was very good at that, and they enjoyed doing that. But like, really, like 99% of his time's on music. So when he gets to his 20s and 30s, he really doesn't know how to or desire to interact with people beyond doing it through music. So this is really the guy who was far more comfortable standing on a stage in front of 100,000 people than he was one on one talking with you or I, and especially if we weren't going to talk about music. So that split within him really defines a lot of his life.
Yeah, and what you were saying earlier about sort of the way that he wanted to kind of stick it to his parents and show them, it's apparent that it's more so with his mother. I was reading that it took him a long time before he actually felt like he would buy his mom a house, and it made me think of comments over the last month that Quentin Tarantino made, that to this day he still won't buy his mom a house because she didn't support him. And you mentioned Michael Jackson. There are so many creative people that it's like, oh yeah, we don't forget that maybe you weren't there for us. And you talk about things like her being invited to the premiere of Purple Rain and his first wedding and stuff like that, but it's mostly just to be like, well, look what I did with myself. And I thought it was interesting as you talk about he had dinner with Michael Jackson, Prince did, and the first thing Michael Jackson says, do your parents ask for money too? And he's like, oh yeah, all the time. And just sort of the offhanded nature of that is, of course, they could relate over that. It made me wonder, Prince is so alone throughout this whole book, his entire life. Why do you think he didn't cultivate friendships with somebody like Michael Jackson, who, the super famous can only relate to other super famous people? I mean, they seem to have had like a professional relationship, but why do you think that he didn't want to put himself out there to somebody that might actually be able to understand what it's like?
I mean, I think that it was very important for Prince to be the man, the guy, and to not share the stage and the spotlight. I mean, like, this is a person who was always like Prince and the revolution, right? Like, I think a critical moment that sort of helps understand what you're driving toward, we are the world, right? I mean, like, everyone knew this is going to be a gigantic thing in culture. Every major singer of the time was invited to be part of this massive charity single. You look back at that video, everybody is there. Prince, they begged him to come. And he was in town the night of the recording. They told him, we will create a special section of the song where you and Michael are singing to each other so that you are within the group but still special and apart. No, no, no. I'm not going to be part of a group. He was not a joiner. He was not going to be sort of on an equal plane with other people. He wanted to be special and unique and different. So some sort of friendship collaboration with somebody like Michael Jackson would have been hard. He was in competition with Michael Jackson. He was in competition with these sort of people. I mean, I beside Michael, I don't even know who else would that even be, right? Like,
Yeah, it's true.
I mean,
I mean, it's
he was friends with Miles Davis. He gave a lot of love to Shaka Khan, Joni Mitchell, George Clinton. So I think the older generation, he was definitely like, Larry Graham, love you guys, be part of my world as much as you want. But his contemporaries, extremely competitive and not giving an inch in terms of like, I'm better than you. I'm going to beat you. But like to what you were saying, the first part of your question, Pepe Willie, who grew up with him and was related to him, a cousin, said that the family called him the lonely guy because he was always by himself. Holidays, he's not coming. He's like off by himself. And, this is part of the curse, I think, of being an entertainer, right? Like a professional entertainer, that a lot of like that you provide the entertainment for other people, but then a lot of time you yourself are alone. And that was definitely his experience.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting anecdote about, when the Purple Rain movie was out and, he was nominated, and this idea that he had to, when he was in Los Angeles, he had to court all the famous people, but he was just incredibly uncomfortable in that. So it's like even somebody that you're not directly in competition with, although I guess technically he was because he was suddenly in movies, but just not having anybody to relate with is something that's so apparent. And I think that somewhere in the book, and I forget who makes the point, that there is this drive to succeed, but then there's also this idea that if you're rehearsing for 5 hours, you do a 3 hour show, and then you make everybody go do a late night gig in a club, you're keeping your day busy. and you're doing it all in the interest of music. So you're focused, but you're also like, well, I don't want to be that lonely guy. And I think that the book really explores the sort of the balance of those two things. I mean, when he has the revolution, that seems to be the most where he feels like it's a family. But anything after that, it's just more like the hired hands. And, it's an interesting point that's made in the book that he would seek out green, sort of inexperienced people because they know they're hungry and they're not going to create problems. So it's like if you want them to work for 12 hours, they will.
Yeah, no, I mean, the bands that he would create, he'd get great players, but people who were on the rise and would value being around Prince so that, yeah, like he was in charge, his law or his rule was not questioned. Look, as far as I could ascertain, he paid one of the highest rates in terms of what he paid his musicians. But that came with, I expect you to be ready to go all the time. We're in the musical fire department, somebody said, because, like, at any time Prince could call or send over a bodyguard, and it's like, the kid wants you, the boss wants you, and it's like, psh, time to go to the studio, time to go to the rehearsal. I mean, like, my God, who was it? I think it was Bobby Z's wedding, where Prince called a recording session after the ceremony.
Yeah, that I read that yesterday, and I do remember that. Yeah, that it was right right after the wedding. It wasn't. I guess the reception wasn't even over, and it's like, well, we got to go record now. Yeah.
Hey, can you imagine? I mean, like, they're all family at this point, right? Because we've been
Yeah.
like touring and recording for for a few years now. Like, we're together every day, so that sort of community, right? Bobby Z gets through the ceremony, and then Prince is like, "Okay, we gotta go record a song," and like, seriously, like today, like right now, like we couldn't even wait until like later. You couldn't put it out to tomorrow, like today of all day. No, yes, now. I mean, even Bobby, like, I just got married. Like, my wife's like, can we do some things together? Take some pictures, do some cake? Like, nope. The boss said, like, wow, and but I think partly it redounds to, this is how he connects with the world. Can he tell you I love you and really express that in the way that you or I might be able to? Not really. He said the words I love you sometimes, but to like really have a heartfelt conversation where he's really explaining and accessing his emotions, he couldn't really do that. Now, he could write a song that could express to you, I love you, I feel you, I see you, I hear you, like you are in my feelings and my mind in a very deep way, which you or I could do just talking to somebody. So, that song in that particular day may have been, a way of expressing, Bobby, I love you, you guys, I love you, but I mean, it was a life lived in music. And this is part of why his marriages are struggling later on. And there's other challenges that are important too, but like the notion that music is the most important thing is a decision that was made long ago. So if you're his wife, you are number two in his life. The music is always going to be number one.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely apparent throughout the different stages in his career that the book looks at. There are so many triumphs throughout the course of his career, but I think there are a couple of really important incidents that I think are very defining to the rest of his career, where it's very much not a success. And he had this overall shyness in terms of performing. And that is on display in this infamously awkward interview with Dick Clark on American Bandstand. So talk about how, like anything, he tackled that shyness on the stage by just really studying, well, what have other frontmen and lead singers done, and how do I learn from them?
Okay, 1 second. Is this going to be edited?
It can be, sure. Yeah, the audio version can definitely be edited. Yeah.
Okay, I am told that somebody is at the door that I need to sign
Okay.
something right now.
That's okay.
Can I pause for like 60
That's
seconds?
absolutely. You go ahead and sign,
All
and
right, I'll be
I'll
right back.
just ask. I'll
I'm
just
sorry.
re-ask the question. Don't worry about it. For people that are watching live right now, Toure's book, "Nothing Compares to You: An Oral History of Prince," is now available, and Toure has also started a podcast. I believe it's called "Who Was Prince," which you can find 2 episodes a week, I believe, or at the very least, it's a weekly episode, and you'll be able to find that. In addition to, he's also written another book about Prince called "I Would Die for You," and his name is spelled Toure. There's a little accent over the E, and that's where you would be able to find all of his books. And we'll rejoin our conversation in a moment. But look, when packages show up, they got to be signed for sometimes, and hopefully, it's a good package. I find that they just tend to leave packages for me, on the step. But every once in a while, there's something that's like, nope, you got to sign. So they keep knocking. And if you want to keep in touch with the show, you can like the Bladtcast on Facebook. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter, Bladtcast. And of course, your one stop shop for our video and audio links is bladtcast.com, Bladtcast. And you can go to the Bladtcast YouTube channel and find this show, the titular Bladtcast, and we also have our other show, Marvel Movie Talk, which we do every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific. That's 2 p.m. Eastern at this point, this stage of the game. That's where you find that. And we have our political show, which is now called Biden Time, and many, many interviews on the Bladtcast YouTube channel, just like this one. So,
Apologize. Thank you.
no worries. I hope I hope it was a good package. They're usually not though. But in terms of the question I was saying earlier, there's this shyness he has for performing, and he has this really awkward interview with Dick Clark on American Bandstand, and so then he realizes that what he really needs to do, as great as he is as a musician, he has to tap into that showman part. But talk about, like I was saying, he handles this the way he does everything, and he sits and watches video and studies what other frontmen and lead singers, from everybody from Jim Morrison to Dolly Parton, what they did. So talk a little bit about that and how that was something he really needed to overcome if he was going to become the rock star he wanted to be.
I mean, Des Dickerson in particular talks about this in that Prince had the humility to understand, what am I not doing to the best of my ability? And if there was something that he lacked, he wasn't like, he had the humility to recognize that and then to zone in and change that weakness into a strength. And I think a lot of people, when they're developing as musicians or writers or anything, they might think like, I'm great, I'm great at everything, rather than being able to really pick your weaknesses and then try to build on them. And he was a great writer. They say he was a really good and prolific writer from his teens. They say he was a really strong player from early on, from his teenage years. But I think the performance part took a little bit longer to come together. And there's a famous performance that they all talk about where, Des Dickerson and Andre Simone were there. So this is early days. This is before I think this is the early days. And he wasn't very good. And, the two of them, for whatever reason, had a little more performing chops, and they were much more comfortable on stage, and he just wasn't. And they think of this as a sort of disastrous show. And, Des was like, the guy clearly, went in the zone or went in the hole and like watched and watched and watched and reemerged and was an extraordinary onstage performer. And part of it, we see, some of the rehearsal footage that's leaked out since he passed. He's performing all day long in front of floor to ceiling mirrors. So he's watching himself and what he's doing and how it looks all the time. So, is extremely practiced and choreographed. All the little moves and the hands and the head and the eye looks and all these things. He practiced the hell out of those, which is to take nothing away from the genius and the performance. But he was very much performing and practicing this person that he would become. Um, I think we see some other people who in history, especially in Black music history, who sort of like get on the stage and lose themselves. And I think he was a little bit more in the inverse direction in terms of get on stage and like, this is what I have practiced immensely, and I'm going to give that to you. But I mean, this is one of the great performers of the century. And, for all the people who first saw him or saw him in the early years and were like, oh, here's the son of Jimi Hendrix and James Brown. If you look at Little Richard, he is truly the son of Little Richard. Little Richard and him side by side, it's like, oh my God, this is the two. This is I mean, like it's uncanny how much he clearly took from Little Richard.
Yeah, and I think that obviously he begins to understand that, but one of the things you write about is how important the crossover appeal was. He didn't want to be considered a black artist. And when he signed to Warner Brothers Records, he very clearly sets the tone that he wants to be a pop artist. And that's why I think it's so significant that he gets this opportunity to open for the Rolling Stones here at the Coliseum in LA. So he's in front of 90,000 people who hate him, and he doesn't even want to do the second show. And Mick Jagger personally calls him and tells him to, because he flew to Minneapolis, he tell him to come back, do it again, and it goes just as badly. But it seems that he very much, as humiliating as that was, he really did learn from it, though, didn't he? What he needed to do to become the superstar.
Well, yeah, the Rolling Stones, the failed Rolling Stones opening gigs of, I believe it was 81, are really, really important. And the guys, I talked to a ton of people about those shows. There's two shows, a Friday and a Sunday. And like, yeah, Mick and Keith had caught wind of Prince and were like, oh, this guy is good. Like, let's give him a chance. Let's let him come open for us on our shows. And, George Thorogood and the Destroyers were also opening. Jay Giles' band was also opening. So, the Stones in the early 80s were still, a contemporary band as opposed to a legacy act that they are now. People said that the crowd was relatively what we would now understand as MAGA-ish, and it's a lot of bikers and tough guys and Dirty Mind. Prince was really trying to push the gender envelope. And I think in society in general at that time, men, let's say, borrowing from women was completely edgy and shocking and taboo. So for Prince to go on stage in leg warmers and heels and, like panties and these sort of things and like, stockings, completely shocking. I think nowadays we would be much more accommodating to a man wanting to make those sort of choices, but then it's like, oh my God. And that audience in particular was not having it. They threw stuff at him, Jack Daniels bottles and chicken and like, cokes, and like it was physically dangerous for the people on the stage. They were like, we're going to get hurt. He runs off the stage, doesn't even signal the band to come off the stage. He just runs off the stage, jumps in the limo, goes to the airport, gets in the plane, and flies back to Minneapolis. And Mick and Keith have to get on the phone and basically plead with him to come back to do the Sunday show. And he does, and it's more of the same. But he does recognize, number one, this is not my audience, because he tells, one of the guys in the band, like, look, when we get to Detroit, it's going to be totally different. This is not the way things normally are. And in a place like Detroit with the big black audience, he was always just like crushing it. But he also changes after that show and after that album, and people located that failed performance, or those two failed performances, as a big part of why he changed So when you go into, the controversy in Dirty Mind, it's controversy in 1999 era, he's wearing more clothes. He's more clothed. It's a little more traditionally masculine. If at least like, like Marie Antoinette era, French, sort of masculine, but like he's covering his body more when in Dirty Mind he was now like this is a person with tons of ideas. So you got to imagine that he was going to develop an influence into something else. Um, but a couple of critical people close to him were like, yeah, those shows were really devastating and really shoved him into the next iteration.
Right, but then of course the success of that iteration shows that he was willing to recognize that yeah, he could have continued to sell out arenas in Pittsburgh. They talk about in the book, and Detroit, as you mentioned. But if he wanted to actually be headlining a stadium, you do have to win over those people, and then obviously the music was always there, but the focus on coming up with basically his signature song, really, I mean, for people that don't really know Prince, they know Purple Rain though, and to have that is really kind of a defining moment of like, well, I have to have it's even in there. I don't think it's a quote from him, but it's like he needs that song where everybody's going to hold up their lighters, the way that they did back then. Now it's everybody puts on their cell phone light, but it's the same idea. It's like, oh, this is the one. This is why I brought the lighter, and just sort of understanding, that those are the people, like, the people who throw the bag of chicken at Prince, possibly a few years later, some of them might have actually bought tickets to see Prince, at the Rose Bowl or something,
Sure. It's possible, I mean, it was an interesting time because I think through Dirty Mind and Controversy, he had developed a large, very passionate Black audience that loved him. I was pretty young at that time, and I remember the older boys, especially at that time, and the older and men talking about Prince and just like this is a really important, interesting, fascinating artist, and we're like sort of hanging on the edge of our seats, like what's he going to do next? What's he going to do next? The band sees it happening though, because early-ish in like the Controversy 1999 era, they're touring like the South, and it's like 80 to 90% Black audiences. And then as time goes on and more hits seep out, and he starts to get played more on white radio, they get more and more white fans coming to the shows to where they have to go back and do cities again. And now the audience is 60, 70% white. I mean, like, folks may not realize or remember when radio was a really dominant figure in defining musical taste. Radio was quite often extremely segregated, and it would be white rock stations, and then there would be what would often be called like urban stations, which would play, at first, soul and funk, and then later, at first they were generally resistant to rap, and
Yeah,
then
sure.
they became like a little more accepting of it, or there would be a separate, hip hop station. But there were very few artists who could do both, who could be on Black and white or rock radio. Michael Jackson was one. There really weren't that many. And Prince aspired to become one, and it took a little bit more time. Michael Jackson was that earlier in his career. It took a little bit more time for Prince to get there, but he was aiming for that, and he got there.
Right, and he didn't want to necessarily be Lionel Richie, whose crossover success was mostly the ballads, and it was like Prince got his rock songs, his 1999 Little Red Corvette, that stuff was on top 40, which I feel like that period of the 80s is why you had the proliferation and the success of top 40, because music was just all of a sudden so different, and it's like, no, but I like Van Halen and I also like Prince, and why that style of top 40 didn't work come the late 90s was because it's like, no, I hate that other stuff.
And Prince was really good too at creating a visual that let white fans feel welcomed into the group. When he is planning the look of the revolution, he's thinking about Sly and the Family Stone. There's black and white, male and female on the stage. So the audience will feel represented when they look at the stage. So he wanted to make sure there were white people, there were women in the band. And all the players he chose were extraordinary. Wendy and Lisa, especially, were extraordinary players with a deep history in music. They'd been playing music since they were, tiny kids. But there was definitely a notion of we're going to skip over. It was not a pure meritocracy, which it never could be in music, but we're going to skip over certain people because we are looking for a particular demographic. We want black and white here. So just because you're the best whatever basis whatever that we've seen today or seen in this audition, but we got 3 black guys, we need a white guy, we're going to go with you. Because they and I know folks talking a lot about women feeling seen and affirmed because Wendy and Lisa were on the stage. I mean, there were so few women who were given big important roles in rock music in the 80s, or the 90s. And there's some, but very, very few.
No, but for the most part, it was a gimmick like the Runaways, where it's like, oh, look, it's the girl group. And, and then some of them went on to have big solo careers. But that, if in the most part, yeah, you would look at bands and the idea that Prince, and it wasn't also just like Prince and the all-female backing band. It was a mixture. It was like clearly he was going for a whole thing. And then that is very clear when they talk about it's like if you set foot out of the hotel, you have to be stage ready at all times. We have to keep this going. And I think that's because obviously, as you talk about in the book, he really understood how MTV changed the way that people took in music because you weren't just hearing it. You needed to see it. And if it's like, oh, that band looks cool, you definitely feel the song more, because it stays with you in a better way.
He lived the mythology. He was Prince 24 hours a day. There are no jeans. There is no downtime. Like, this is who I am. And for people who talked about him in high school and say he was kind of like Pedro from Napoleon Dynamite, and said things like, where'd that guy get the personality implant? It seems like it perhaps was very much like Lady Gaga in that, like Stephanie Germanotta and Gaga are different. And at some point, Stephanie said, like, I'm going to be Gaga 24 hours a day. And every time you see me coming out of a hotel or whatever, I'm going to be, like high fashion, performative look like. And that was Prince decades earlier that like, I am rock star ready 24 hours a day. I live here and I don't, leave this space. And the rest of the band had to be that way as well. Okay, can we pause?
Yeah, no, I was about to say, I know you need to go you need to run out and not sign for another package. But we'll take a little break and people will be able to watch part 2 of the interview and then the audio version will be all put together. So just subscribe to our YouTube channel, BLADTCAST, and you'll be notified when part 2 is coming up a little bit later. And Toure, hang on a second. I'm going to click off the broadcast.